Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind that does not quite settle but softens the sound of the streets and makes the lamps appear more generous than they are. Oxford, in such weather, becomes a city for ghosts. The cobbles along Holywell Street were almost deserted when I crossed to the King's Arms, my coat collar turned up more for habit than for warmth. Inside, the air was stale with the aftertaste of beer and the faint musk of damp wool. I took my usual seat near the window. From here, you could look up across the darkened quad towards Magdalen's Tower, where the faint blur of candlelight in the upper chambers seemed almost medieval, as though time there moved differently. The bells had been ringing earlier, their tone oddly muffled by the snow. Now the choir's voices floated faintly down, thin threads of melody that never quite reached a full weave. Something about the cadence was wrong. Not wrong enough for anyone but me to notice, but wrong nonetheless. At the bar, a student in a long fraying scarf leaned towards the barman, speaking in the confidential tone of one who believes the world will find his information irresistible. I was not listening at first, but words have a way of finding the corners of one's mind. Chapel Verger. Strange letter. No signature. I turned slightly in my chair, letting the pint glass hover between table and lips, listening without appearing to. The letter, he said, claimed a death long past was no accident, and that this Christmas the truth would walk again. The boy said it as though it were a line from a play, something he admired for its theatricality. The barman shook his head, not in disbelief, but in the weary fashion of someone used to absorbing the dramas of others. The student grinned, ordered another drink, and the moment was over. I sipped slowly. The beer was lukewarm, the head gone. I could have asked for another, but the idea of the effort seemed somehow disproportionate to the reward. Outside, the snow thickened, catching in the streetlight. I let the words of the letter repeat themselves in my head. A death long past. No accident. This Christmas, the truth will walk again. I've always found that the mind stores certain details like folded scraps of paper, tucked away, forgotten until the time comes to retrieve them. This felt like one of those scraps. Perhaps it was the choir's carol that held it there. I could hear them even now, their voices carrying something unresolved. The final chord was off, as though one of the trebles had faltered on a note he'd sung 100 times before, only a fraction flat. Yet the ear remembers such things. There was a man once, years ago, who had confessed to me that he knew his wife had taken a lover because she had begun humming a different tune while she cooked. Not wrong, he'd said, just different. A change so small that only the heart could hear it. The student had gone by the time I looked again. A pair of tourists occupied his place, their bright coats steaming slightly from the thawing snow. I drained my pint and stood, feeling the weight of the evening in my shoulders. On my way out, I glanced up once more at the tower. The choir had moved on to another piece, something I did not recognize. The sound was clean now, the wrongness gone, or perhaps simply concealed. Snowflakes gathered briefly in my hair before melting into nothing. Some cases begin with the clamour of an alarm, a body on the ground, a voice shouting for the police. Others arrive quietly, like the first few bars of a song you half remember but cannot name. This was the latter, and though I had no cause to act, I knew that letter would not let me go. The snow had not shifted overnight. It lay in thin, uneven drifts against the cloisters, making the flagstones treacherous underfoot. The chapel door resisted slightly before yielding, the oak swelling in the damp. Inside, the air was warmer than expected, thick with candle wax and the faint sweetness of lilies. The choir stalls loomed in dark rows, carved angels leaning in as though to overhear any confession. Mrs. Preston was already there, her black coat still buttoned despite the heat. She had been verger for as long as I could remember, a brisk, bird-like woman whose sense of duty had the unyielding quality of old wood. She wasted little time. The letter, she said, was about Dr. Adrian Bell, a popular man, taught the classics, always smiling. The sort of smile, she added, that didn't make you feel like a fool for not knowing something. He had died on a snowy night, 5 years ago, found at the bottom of the staircase in staircase 4. The coroner had called it misadventure. Bell had been drinking, There had been a dinner in hall that night, and the steps were slick with snow. The college had grieved, of course. There had been a service, a plaque placed on the north wall. Mrs. Preston's voice wavered just slightly on the word service before returning to its usual matter-of-fact tone. As she spoke, my eye drifted to the row of memorial plaques along the wall. Brass, each one engraved with a steady hand, each bearing the patina of years. Except one. Bells. It gleamed faintly in the candlelight, the lettering crisp. Someone had polished it recently, within weeks, perhaps days. The others were dulled, their surfaces softened by time and neglect, but his seemed determined to announce itself. I asked Mrs. Preston who might have done it. She shook her head. "Could have been anyone," she said. "A colleague, a former pupil. People still leave flowers sometimes." He was well liked. The phrase was gentle, but it carried something underneath, a kind of protective reluctance to have him examined too closely. The carol service was due to begin, the choir gathering quietly in the stalls. The white surplices brushed against the dark wood as they took their places. I sat to the side, half hidden by a pillar, the better to watch without. Being watched. It was then I saw it. An empty space in the second row of tenors, the carved seat unoccupied. Not a gap in the music, but a gap in the arrangement of bodies, as though the absence had been rehearsed into the formation. I remembered dimly a young man who had stood there once, a tenor with a pale, narrow face, and a voice that carried unusually well in the upper register. His name would not come to me, but I recalled that he had left suddenly, a year or two after Bell's death. No explanation offered, at least not to me. The choir began, the first notes rising like breath on a winter morning. I let the sound carry me while my eyes remained on that empty stall. An absence can be louder than a presence if you listen in the right way. It was as though the wood itself had been waiting for someone to return. The service ended without incident. The congregation filed out, the snow muffling their steps. Mrs. Preston lingered, collecting service sheets left behind in the pews. I asked if she remembered the tenor who had once sung from that place. She hesitated, looking towards it, then shook her head. "People come and go," she said. "That's Oxford." Her tone was final, but her glance at the empty seat was not. Outside, the snow had begun again, a fine dust in the air, turning the lamplight to a soft haze. The plaque, the polished brass letters, the empty stall. They were small things, hardly evidence, hardly anything at all. But they had the feel of a pattern waiting to emerge. The senior common room at St. Swithin's always struck me as a place where warmth was something you negotiated, not received. A fire burned, yes, but it had the air of being kept alight, for tradition rather than comfort, and the leather chairs arranged around it were too deep for the sort of conversation that led anywhere useful. Lewis took the far corner, notebook at the ready, leaving me to steer the thing. Sir Peter Densham, the bursar, was first. A tall man in a suit cut so precisely it could have served as a diagram of itself. His voice was dry, every word rationed. Bell? Yes, they'd been colleagues. A fine man, very capable. We were all at the Fellows' Christmas dinner that night. He said it, as one might recite an entry in an accounts ledger. When pressed, he offered the sort of alibi that sounded airtight, only because it had been repeated often enough. Arrived at 7, left after the port. Snow falling heavily by then. No, he had not walked Bell back to his rooms. No, he had noticed nothing unusual. Next came Dr. Lorna Vale, literature fellow, early 40s, a smile that gave the impression of welcome but also of something kept firmly behind a door. The smile did not quite reach her eyes. She spoke of Bell with an easy fluency, as if accustomed to being asked. Charming. Good company at table. Knew more about Horace than anyone she'd met. All the while she kept her fingers curled around the stem of an empty glass, turning it slowly without, noticing. It was when I asked about the dinner itself that she faltered. He was almost happy that night, she said, and then, too quickly, corrected herself. Perfectly happy. She looked at me then, as if to see whether I had heard the slip. I did not give her the satisfaction. Almost is a word that never strays far from my attention. It is a crack in a pane, a note held just shy of its pitch. Father Michael Trent arrived last, smelling faintly of incense and something sharper. Dry sherry, if I wasn't mistaken. He was genial in the way clergymen sometimes are when they've learned that geniality buys them more than confession does. He too had been at the dinner. Bell had seemed in good spirits. No arguments, no shadows. A pleasant evening. His eyes drifted now and then towards the decanter by the sideboard. All three of them spoke of the same night, and yet it was not quite the same night. Sir Peter's account was all timings and weather, Dr. Vale's, half-formed phrases and corrections, Father Trent's, a litany of calm reassurance. No contradictions, but no life either. As they talked, I let my gaze drift over the room. The portraits of former masters, the gilt clock whose hands moved almost imperceptibly, the smell of old upholstery and dust, and there, above the mantel, a small group photograph in a silver frame. Fellows gathered in the snow, scarves and overcoats, the tower in the background. Bell was among them, smiling faintly. Not broadly, not warmly, just faintly, as though someone had caught him thinking of something else. When we left, Lewis asked if I believed them. I said belief had nothing to do with it. People rarely lie outright in places like this. They edit, remove a detail here, smooth a phrase there, until the truth is polite enough to be repeated. Outside, the quad was a flat white sheet under the early dark. The chapel lamps were lit, throwing long, narrow shadows across the snow. Almost happy, she had said. I heard the word again as we walked away, the way one hears a note that has not yet resolved, waiting for the chord to fall into place. Lewis arrived in my office with a file that looked as though it had been rescued from the back of a damp cupboard. The cover was warped, the edges feathered, and the handwriting on the label barely legible. Student Disciplinary, it read in a crabbed script, and below that the name James Rowntree. Rowntree had been an undergraduate in Bell's final years at St. Swithin's, clever, a little too sure of himself, and, it seemed, in trouble. The file made for curious reading. Nothing definitive enough to be called a crime, but enough to bring him within arm's reach of expulsion. Missing tutorials, unexplained absences, an examination paper too close in phrasing to another student's work. It was all handled quietly, the way colleges prefer. The papers showed Bell intervening repeatedly, arguing for clemency, his notes to the dean written in a hand that grew more urgent as the months passed. In the back were letters from Rowntree himself. At first, breezy and grateful, full of promises to improve. Then later, more intimate in tone, a sort of guarded warmth that suggested a closeness beyond the usual tutor-student arrangement. One line in particular caught my eye. "You've been my only anchor, and I'm sorry for what the tide's made of me." The metaphor was too deliberate to be casual. Bell's efforts came to nothing in the end. Rowntree's name was quietly removed from the college register. The file concluded with a note. Subject believed to have left the country. No forwarding address. Lewis had the look of someone who thought he'd brought me something sharp enough to cut the case open. There was a shape to it, certainly. A young man saved from disgrace by a beloved tutor, only to fall anyway, perhaps nursing a wound deep enough to fester. The mind begins to stitch these scraps together. 5 years later, a letter to the verger, a death long past, the truth walking again. I found myself wondering whether Rowntree had ever truly left Oxford. Men return under different names in different guises. A lectureship in another college, a post in administration, even a place in the choir. The city is a labyrinth of faces that change just enough to evade the casual glance. We walked across to the registry, the snow underfoot compacted into a pale gloss that made the steps treacherous. Inside, the smell of paper and floor polish, the long corridor lined with narrow windows. The registrar herself, precise in a grey suit, retrieved the archives without fuss. Rowntree, James Adrian, born 1966. Matriculated Michaelmas 1984. Expelled Trinity 1987. Departed for Canada. No record of re-enrollment, no alias linked to his original student number. Lewis suggested that if Rowntree had returned, he might have done so without ever touching the official rolls. A friend's spare room, casual work, the kind of existence that leaves no trace for a bureaucrat to catch. I agreed in theory, but something in the file bothered me. Bell's notes had a persistence to them, but also an undertone I could not place, as though he were pleading not just for Rowntree's future, but for something of his own. We left empty-handed, the registrar's politeness closing over us like water. Outside, the snow was still falling, though more finely now, each flake dissolving before it touched the ground. It struck me that Rowntree might have been nothing more than the first false glint on the surface. A red herring, the fishermen used to call them. The kind you chase because it flashes just enough like truth in the half-light. Still, I kept the file. Some herring, after all, turn out not to be red at all once you've cleaned them properly. High table, like so many of Oxford's rituals, was less about food than about the choreography of glances and pauses. The dishes arrived in solemn procession, silver lids lifted with a flourish too practiced to feel grand, and the conversation moved in slow, deliberate eddies, never straying too far from the safe harbours of scholarship and anecdote. I was there as a guest, though I doubted anyone remembered inviting me by the time the soup was served. Sir Peter Densham, seated opposite, was holding forth on something half to do with the college's building repairs and half to do with Victorian poetry. It was in the midst of this that he quoted Tennyson, a line from In Memoriam, but he altered it. Where the poet wrote of quiet sense, Sir Peter said quiet penance. No stumble, no correction. The substitution was made with the ease of someone speaking a phrase he had rehearsed. The word lodged itself in my mind like a pebble in a shoe. Sense and penance occupy entirely different ground, yet both fit the metre so well that one could imagine them jostling for position on the page. I let the rest of the conversation pass me by, content to watch the firelight pick out the brass fittings of the hall lamps. After dinner, I found my way to the college library. The room was almost deserted, save for a student asleep under a reading lamp, his face pressed into a book of statutes. The shelves still carried the scent of dust and leather, that particular blend which seems to slow one's breathing. I began, without quite deciding to search the poetry section. It was there I found it, a first edition of Tennyson, the cloth cover faded to a greenish brown, the spine gently cracked. On the page containing the altered line, Quiet Penance, had been neatly underlined in pencil. The mark was faint but careful, the graphite unbroken along the length of the words. On the flyleaf, a small inscription in blue-black ink, to A, with fond hope, L. The handwriting was fine, almost severe, the kind that belongs to someone who corrects their own loops and flourishes. I turned the book in my hands, the boards warm from the radiator beneath the shelf. A could easily be Adrian Bell, L might be Lorna Vale, or it might not. The inscription offered no year, no occasion. Fond hope for what? Academic success, personal redemption, or something more entangled, something that had required hope to begin with. Lewis, when I mentioned it later, shrugged in the way of men who see no point in conjecture before the facts have introduced themselves. But there was something about Sir Peter's easy substitution, and the fact of the underlined line in a book that had clearly been read, perhaps re-read, by someone with a reason to notice it. People rarely alter a poet's words without intent. It is either carelessness or confession. Before leaving, I replaced the book exactly where I had found it, aligning it with its neighbours. In investigations, as in libraries, disruption can be its own form of warning. Outside, the night air was sharper, the snow from earlier in the week now crusted into dull ice along the cloisters. The hall, behind me, still glowed, the laughter of fellows carrying faintly into the dark. I walked back across the quad, the phrase moving through my mind as if to some unspoken rhythm. Quiet penance. It sounded less like poetry and more like a verdict, one spoken not in a court but in the privacy of one's own conscience. By morning the city had been remade. A fresh fall of snow had worked itself into every corner of the quad, softening the stone, erasing the footpaths of the previous day. The air was sharp enough to make the lungs sting, and my breath hung briefly before dispersing into the whiteness. Oxford wears snow awkwardly. It is too much like a costume, a layer of prettiness laid over the slow erosion of its walls. I walked without hurry, my boots leaving solitary marks in the immaculate surface. The college seemed deserted, though a faint hum of pipes in the walls reminded me that somewhere, in rooms beyond my sight, radiators were ticking into life, and kettles were being filled. Bell came to me as I walked, not as the man in the photograph above the mantel in the common room, but as I remembered him years ago, lecturing in a narrow seminar room with its windows fogged from the inside. He had been speaking of Greek tragedy, of how the form was less about punishment than confession, that in the theatre of Athens to speak one's guilt aloud was already a kind of absolution, whether or not the gods were listening. I had thought it sentimental at the time, but it returned now with an edge I could not explain. Lewis found me there, hands in his coat pockets, the tip of his nose reddened by the cold. He had news. Bell had changed his will a week before his death. Not drastically. His modest estate was divided much as before, but, with one curious alteration, a small bequest to the chapel choir fund. A gesture, Lewis said, that might have gone unnoticed had it not been so close to the end. And Mrs. Preston, the verger, had been one of the witnesses to the new will. That, in itself, was unremarkable. Witnesses are often drawn from whatever staff happened to be nearby, but the choice of beneficiary gave me pause. I asked Lewis whether Mrs. Preston had ever been involved with the choir. He said no, not as far as he knew. She is tone-deaf, I told him. I had heard her once, years ago, attempting the final verse of a hymn during evensong. The memory was vivid, though not for musical reasons. It struck me now as oddly fitting, a woman who could not carry a tune witnessing a gift meant for singers. Lewis suggested it might have been a general act of goodwill. Bell had been fond of the choir, after all. Perhaps he thought them underfunded. Possible. But wills are curious documents. Their real sentences are often buried in the asides. A bequest like that could have been nothing more than sentiment, or it could have been the equivalent of leaving a single red thread in a drawer, knowing that someone some day might tug at it. We crossed the quad together, our footsteps side by side. In the far corner, a gardener was scattering grit along the cloister walk, each handful darkening the snow in small, uneven patches. The chapel tower loomed above us, its bells silent. As we reached the archway, I paused and looked back. The quad lay untouched again in my mind's eye, as it must have been in the hours before Bell's body was found. The snow unbroken, the windows black, the silence heavy enough to feel. Somewhere in that stillness, a man had walked his final steps, leaving marks in the snow that were gone by morning. Greek tragedies, Bell had said, were a form of confession, but confessions can be made in more than words. A change to a will, an underlined phrase in a book, a plaque polished until it gleams. The difficulty lies in knowing which are acts of guilt and which are only the passing gestures of the living. The porter's lodge had been stripped of its old tobacco haze and smells of damp coats, but it still kept the air of a place where secrets pass between two people who both know they are speaking in confidence. Mr. Jarvis, retired these 5 years, had agreed to meet me there, though he made it clear at the outset he would rather be in his allotment than stirring up college business from the past. It was over the dregs of a mug of tea that he told me what he had seen, or thought he had seen, on the night Bell died. He had been making his rounds, the snow coming down hard, when he looked across the quad and noticed movement in staircase 4, a figure on the stairs pausing on the first landing. Even in the gloom, Jarvis was certain it was Father Trent. A moment later, he heard, or imagined he heard, a muffled thud, then nothing. By the time he crossed the quad, the stairwell was empty. Bell's body was found later, lying awkwardly in the snow at the bottom. Jarvis had told no one at the time. Too much uncertainty, he said. Too much risk of being wrong. And now? I asked. Well, he was older and certain enough to speak. I found Trent in the vestry, sorting through service sheets with a precision that suggested he might be avoiding something less tidy. When I told him of Jarvis's recollection, he did not flinch. Yes, he had been there. He had gone to Bell's pigeonhole to collect a letter Bell had asked him to destroy without reading. He said it plainly, as though there were no room for suspicion in such an act. Why? I asked. Because Bell feared a scandal, Trent replied. That was the word he used, scandal, as if pronouncing a relic of the last century. I pressed him on the contents, but he claimed not to know. I asked whether the letter had been addressed to Bell or sent by him. Trent shook his head. He had not looked. He had done as asked, gone to the stairwell, retrieved the envelope, and burned it in his grate. The image was neat and damning, the chaplain late at night, in the very place and hour of Belle's death, handling a la sabie. Letter whose existence could not now be proved. It was enough to set the mind aligning the rest of the pieces, the altered will, the bequest to the choir, the slip in Dr. Vale's voice. For an hour or two, I believed Trent guilty, of what, precisely, I wasn't sure, but guilty nonetheless. Then the detail returned to me, Jarvis, squinting in the low light of the lodge, once showing me how he could just make out the hands of the clock above the gate. He was nearly blind in one eye, the other clouded with cataract even before he retired. On a dark, snowy night, with only the stairwell lamp and the drift of snow for contrast, he could have mistaken almost anyone for Trent. The certainty drained from the picture. Trent might have been there, or not. The porter might have seen him, or someone else entirely. The letter, if it existed, might have been harmless, or its contents might have shifted the entire case. We would never know. That night I walked through the quad alone. Snow had begun to fall again, the flakes catching briefly in the yellow glow of the lamps before vanishing into the dark. I thought of Trent at his grate, feeding a letter into the fire without knowing its words, and of Jarvis at the window, watching shadows on the stairs. Between them lay the shape of a truth I could almost see, but like all shadows it shifted when I stepped closer. Dr. Lorna Vale opened her door only part way, as though to make it clear she was allowing me into her rooms rather than inviting me. The gas fire was already on, the air close with the faint sweetness of sherry and the musk of books whose bindings had begun to crumble. She was in an uncharacteristically plain cardigan, her hair loosely pinned, giving her the look of someone who had been waiting to be interrupted. I had asked, gently I thought, whether she had ever come across anything of Belle's after his death. For a moment her gaze moved past me, towards the rain-speckled window, and I thought she might tell me no. Instead, she crossed to a low drawer and returned with a small object wrapped in tissue paper, placing it on the coffee table between us. The diary was bound in red leather, the edges worn to a soft fray, the gilt on the page edges mostly gone. A narrow silk ribbon still marked a place somewhere in the middle. I opened it cautiously. Belle's handwriting was steady, compressed, a script that seemed to guard its meaning as much as reveal it. She said she had found it months after his death, tucked between 2 volumes of Dante on her own shelf. How it came to be there she could not say. Most entries were brief, lecture notes, appointments, half-finished quotations from poetry in Greek and Latin. But when I turned to December, I found a gap. The page for the 24th had been removed entirely, the stub of the binding showing where the paper had been torn out cleanly. On the preceding day, however, there was a sentence that caught at me. If the choir sings the carol in, the minor, I shall know. No further explanation. No indication of what would be known or why. Only the neat hand and the deliberate phrasing. I read it twice before closing the book. The choir had sung a minor arrangement this year. I'd noticed it at the first carol service, a shadow in the melody that had lodged in my ear. And now I remembered. They had sung the same version the year Belle died. Not the usual major setting, but one with an old, austere sadness to it, as though the tune had been bent under some private weight. I asked Lorna if she recalled the carol that Christmas. She hesitated. Perhaps, she said, though she didn't know the difference between keys. She had a small smile then, faint and brittle, as though to suggest the technicalities of music were for other people. I left the diary with her. She had not offered to give it up, and I had not asked. There are moments when possession matters less than the knowledge that something exists. Outside, the snow had given way to a fine mist, turning the quad's white surface into a grey slush. I walked towards the chapel, almost without thinking, and found myself inside, the smell of wax and damp stone rising to meet me. The choir stalls were empty, the candles long extinguished, but in my mind I could hear the shape of that carol, not the notes themselves, but the colour of them, their turn into minor at the close of each verse. Belle had known something tied to that arrangement. A signal, perhaps, a confirmation of suspicion. Whatever it was, it had been important enough to record on the 23rd of December, and then to erase from the next day altogether. I stood there for some time, looking at the empty place in the tenor row, and thought of how a piece of music can be a message to anyone who knows how to listen. This year, as in that year, the message had been sent. Whether it had been received and by whom remained the question. It was well past midnight when Morse returned to his small flat, the snow outside muting the world into a strange and watchful silence. He made tea, poured a generous splash of whiskey into it, and laid the unsigned letter on his desk. It had been nagging at him for days, the rhythm of its sentences, the slightly archaic turns of phrase, the deliberate precision in punctuation. Morse had always believed style was as telling as fingerprints, and now he had the itch that comes when something once overlooked suddenly begins to demand attention. He read the letter again, slowly. I was there on the night when Belle died. He spoke of relief, of a burden lifted, and I let him walk away. The stairs were slick with snow, but I might have stopped him. I might have. Morse's finger traced the line, burden lifted. The word seemed oddly literary, even contrived. And then it came to him, not the words themselves, but the way they were placed. He had seen that cadence before. He rummaged through his notes, a disorganized heap of scribbles, receipts, and college pamphlets, until he found a photocopy from the Bodleian archives, an essay on Milton's later works, authored by Dr. Lorna Vale, published in a journal so obscure it probably had fewer readers than the number of fellows in her college. Morse set the two texts side by side. The match was subtle, but unmistakable. The same habit of using an em-dash instead of a full stop to end a thought. The same unhurried, almost confessional tone. Even the odd comma placement, after an I, a pause not strictly grammatical but somehow personal. Lewis arrived the next morning, stamping snow from his boots, and found Morse already in his coat. "You've had an idea," Lewis said. "I've had a certainty," Morse replied, picking up the letter and the journal copy. "Whoever wrote this confession has been giving us the courtesy of their signature all along, just not in ink." They crossed the quad, the snow crunching underfoot, to Dr. Vale's set of rooms. She answered the door in a charcoal cardigan, looking more tired than usual, her eyes faintly red-rimmed. Morse held up the 2 pages without introduction. "You wrote the letter," he said. Her gaze flicked to the papers, then away. "You're mistaken." "Your style isn't easily mistaken, Doctor." "Vale," Morse said, stepping past her into the book-lined room. "The phrasing, the punctuation, even the way you balance a sentence on a dash. You might as well have signed it." For a long moment she said nothing. The clock on her mantel ticked with the slow, unrelenting patience of Oxford time. Finally, she exhaled. "It was a form of penance," she said quietly. "Not a confession of my own guilt, at least not directly. I believed— No, I knew. I had failed him." She sat down, her hands folded tightly together. "Adrian came to me that evening after the fellows' dinner. He told me he had finally spoken the truth to someone, a truth he'd hidden for years." He was shaking. "I told him to go to bed. He smiled. I thought he was calming, and left. I didn't follow him." Lewis's voice was gentler than usual. "What truth did he tell you?" She shook her head. "That's not mine to tell. I thought if I wrote the letter, someone might start asking the questions I never dared to ask that night. I left it unsigned, hoping it would be seen as an opening." Morse looked at her for a long while. "And you never told the police?" "Would you have, Inspector?" she said, her voice almost breaking. There was nothing to say to that. Morse folded the letter carefully as if sealing away a piece of something fragile, and left without another word. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the air was sharp with frost. Morse knew the truth had moved closer, but not close enough to touch. The chapel was empty but for the faint halo of candlelight along the altar rail. Outside, snow muffled the sounds of the city. Inside, the air carried the faint tang of candle wax and old wood, as though the room itself were waiting for something unspoken to surface. Morse stood near the side aisle, his coat collar turned up, not from cold, but from habit. Lorna Vale entered quietly, her boots barely marking the stone floor. She glanced at the votive stand as if considering a flame, then turned to him with an expression that had more fatigue than fear. "You asked to meet," she said, her voice catching on the word asked. "I did," Morse replied, keeping his eyes on the flickering candles rather than her face. There's something about Belle's death that doesn't fit the version everyone's agreed upon. I think you know what it is." For a moment she said nothing, only slipped her gloves off one finger at a time, the leather creaking faintly. Then she walked towards the front pew and sat, leaning forward as though in prayer. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she began. Bell was in the SCR that night. He'd had too much wine, far too much, but he was driven. He told me he was going to confront Peter, Sir Peter Densham, gambling debts, college money, relabelled as hospitality expenditure. Bell had the proof. Her gaze moved to the stained glass window above the altar, the Annunciation scene, the angel frozen mid-benediction. "I told him not to," she continued. "Not on Christmas Eve, not like that, but he was determined. We argued in the corridor by the east staircase. He called me a coward. She stopped, swallowed. "I shoved him, not hard, just enough. He was drunk and the snow had blown in through the open door. His foot went out from under him. I remember the sound, not the fall, but the end of it." And then silence. Morse did not move. "I didn't run," she said. "I walked, back into the dining hall. No one noticed. They were all telling some dreadful anecdote about porters and pheasants. Belle lay there in the snow while I poured myself a glass of wine I couldn't drink." "And the diary?" Morse asked. Her eyes flicked to him. "The missing page? A poem? Half of one, for me. I didn't want it found." She gave a thin smile. "Imagine that, Morse. All this, and I destroyed the only kindness left between us." He let the words settle. The silence between them was almost comfortable, in a way that only those who shared a secret could manage. "You ghost-wrote the confession," Morse said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "Not to protect myself. At least, that's what I told myself. I thought I owed him the truth, even if it came in another hand. A kind of quiet penance." The phrase landed in the air between them like a snowflake that refused to melt. From somewhere outside came the faint sound of the choir rehearsing for midnight mass. The same carol, in the same strange minor key Bell had noted in his diary. Lorna closed her eyes. "When I heard it again this year," she said, "I knew I wouldn't get through another Christmas like the last." Morse looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'll have to tell them," he said finally. "I know." The candles guttered in a draught, their shadows stretching across the stone walls like thin fingers. Lorna rose, smoothing her skirt as though preparing to address a seminar. She moved past him without another word, her boots clicking softly on the stone. When the door closed behind her, Morse remained in the pew a while longer, listening to the carol in the minor, and wondering if the word for what he felt was justice, or something colder. The morning of the 27th broke pale and brittle, the frost silvering the high walls of St. Luke's, as though the stones themselves had taken on a shiver. Morse sat in his office at the station, the single-bar heater glowing a weak orange, listening to the slow tick of the clock above the door. He had been staring at the telephone for nearly an hour before lifting it, as though the call might feel less like betrayal if delayed. When Lorna Vale answered, her voice was steady, almost relieved. She agreed to come down to the station without fuss. "Better before term starts," she said, as if arranging a tutorial. "No need for an audience." Morse heard the scrape of a chair and the quiet closing of a door. That was all. Lewis drove the unmarked car to the college gates, where Lorna stood waiting in a long wool coat, her gloves clasped neatly in front of her. The porter, one of the newer ones young enough to treat all this as a curiosity, pretended not to notice as she stepped into the back seat. No one spoke during the short drive. The roads were still edged with snow, the ruts frozen hard. Morse found himself glancing at her in the rearview mirror more than once. She met his gaze only once, and there was something in her look, not defiance, not regret, but the calm of someone who had been waiting for a train, whose timetable she'd known all along. At the station, Lewis took her details. Morse excused himself under the pretext of checking paperwork, but instead went to stand by the window, watching the pale sun rise over the rooftops. Lorna's voice carried faintly from the interview room, unhurried and clear. She answered each question without embellishment. By midday, the formalities were done. The custody sergeant took her rings and watch. Lorna did not look back as she was led away, though Morse imagined, fancifully, that she might have wanted to. That evening the invitation to the St. Luke's post-Christmas feast lay on his mantelpiece, the heavy cards slightly warped from the heat of the fire. He had not yet replied, and now he saw no point in doing so. Instead, he pulled on his overcoat and walked back through the crisp air to the college. The quad was empty, the snow unmarked save for the narrow tracks of a cat that had ventured across from the kitchens. In the corner near the chapel, a small marble plaque bore the name of Arthur Bell. No dates, only a line from Sophocles. Count no man happy until he dies, free of pain at last. Morse stood before it longer than he intended, his breath clouding the inscription. From inside the chapel came the faint strains of the choir rehearsing for New Year's Eve. The sound was softened by the snow, so that it seemed to reach him from some other time entirely, Bell's time perhaps, when the words were still whole and the music had not yet curdled into irony. Morse listened until the voices faded, then turned away, his shoes crunching in the frost. The porter at the gate raised a hand in greeting. Morse nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and stepped back into the lamplight of the high street. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and distant bells, but the night felt colder than the thermometer would suggest. Somewhere, far off, the choir began again. Morse did not look back. The late afternoon had folded itself into night without ceremony. Rain earlier in the day had frozen to a brittle crust beneath the snow, so that every step on Walton Street was accompanied by a muted crunch, like the sound of a page turning somewhere far away. Morse let himself into his flat, shedding his overcoat in a motion more weary than deliberate, and reached for the half-full bottle of claret on the sideboard. The cork, only loosely replaced, came away without protest. The crossword from that morning's Oxford mail was still on the small table by the armchair. It had been languishing there since breakfast, a dozen clues stubbornly refusing to yield, though the rest had surrendered earlier in the week. Morse sank into the chair, the glass poised at his lips, scanning the black and white grid as if it were the face of an old adversary. 8 down, where truth lies. 10. A clever one, he thought. It had been nagging at the edge of his mind for hours, an itch beneath the skin of thought. He took a slow sip of the wine, letting the tannins open on his tongue, and closed his eyes. The answer came, not with a jolt, but with the inevitability of something long known. Confession, where truth lies, both in its telling and in its concealment. He wrote the letters in his precise slanted hand, completing the puzzle without ceremony. A small satisfaction, and yet it seemed to carry the weight of the entire week. He leaned back, listening. At first there was nothing but the quiet creak of the building settling into the cold, the occasional sigh of the radiator. Then, through the double glazing, faint and far off, he caught it. Voices. The choir. They were rehearsing again in the chapel, the sound travelling across the snow-muted streets as if on a wire. Morse tilted his head, allowing the melody to thread its way into the room. It was the same carol, the one Bell had marked in his diary, the one that had played on that Christmas Eve. He could picture it, the boys in white surplices, their faces lit by the warm flicker of candles, the nave breathing faint clouds of breath into the air, the ancient beams overhead holding more centuries than any man could comprehend. And then, the ending, that unexpected, unsettling minor chord. Even knowing it was coming, it made the hairs on the back of his neck rise, an ending that did not resolve, a truth that did not comfort. He rose to refill his glass but did not turn on the radio. The silence between the notes seemed more eloquent than anything the BBC could offer. He stood by the window, looking down on the street where snow lay undisturbed, except for a single track of footprints disappearing into the dark. Oxford was sleeping under its white blanket, and yet Morse felt its restless dreams. He thought of Lorna Vale, now alone in a cell somewhere, perhaps composing another line of verse in her mind, of Sir Peter returning to his accounts with a practised air of innocence, of Bell lying at the foot of the stair, snow settling on his coat like the quietest benediction, and of himself, for ever walking the narrow corridor between justice and truth, knowing the two rarely arrived in the same place. The choir began again, and the sound, impossibly distant yet piercing, carried him back to the first snowfall of his boyhood, when the world had seemed clean and unbroken. But even then, he supposed, the cracks had been there, waiting beneath the surface. Morse set the glass down, the crossword folded neatly beside it. The minor chord hung in the air a moment longer before fading into silence.